to this, the third in the series of Lunchtime Learning from calQrisk. Today we're going to talk about bow tie risk assessment technique. You can, if you've missed the first two, you can see them on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube channel calQrisk, and if you Google it, you'll find it. These are 15-minute webinars, and we take one subject, or as I say, risk management in small bites, and try to cover that in the 15 minutes. Okay. Very briefly, then, to us, where we see ourselves as experienced risk and compliance professionals like you guys, and we try to keep our skills sharp by being members of various organisations like Institute of Risk Management, Institute of Bankers, Compliance Ireland, Institute of Directors, and so on. Personally, I'm involved in the 31,000 Risk Management Standard. Indeed, I chair the National Committee on Risk Management Standards, and I'm a member of ISO's Technical Committee for Risk Management Standards. Through that, we get to meet people from other countries and discuss risk, so I like to keep our skills sharp. And yes, we supply a solution, a governance, risk and compliance solution called calQrisk, but that's not what it's about today. Our customers, that's over 200, generally in the financial services sector, so insurance, credit unions, fund management, and the not-for-profit sector, housing associations, sport associations, and charities. Okay. I like Mark Twain. And when I couldn't find an appropriate quote for bow tie, I said, I put up a Mark Twain quote. It ain't what you know, what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. I like it. Nothing got to do with bow tie, but I like the quote. Okay. To give some context to the bow tie risk assessment technique, I'm going back to the ISO 31000 risk management process, because risk assessment is part of that process. And when you look closely, risk assessment is three things. People often tend to think it's the risk analysis part, but it's actually identification, analysis, and evaluation. You have to identify a risk first before you can analyze it. And when you have analyzed, then you have to make some decision as to whether you're going to accept this risk, tolerate it, or whether you're going to take action and treat the risk. If I move to the next slide, you'll see, if you're going to do an assessment, ask yourself, what's the purpose of the assessment today? Is it to identify risks or to analyze ones that you've already identified? Or is it to consider whether the risk is acceptable? Maybe it's all three, because that is risk assessment. And you could drill down and say, well, I want to further understand the sources. Or maybe it's, you have analyzed it and now you need to take some action, but you don't know which action to take. You want to compare options. There are techniques for all of this. Now, when I say there are lots of techniques, I could probably tell you 25, but I'm only showing you here 7 here. 7 of the more common ones. But be aware that if you have a particularly difficult risk that you need to assess and understand and take some action on, there are other techniques available. Now, thankfully, 90% of your risks you probably would be able to assess and evaluate with one or two methods. But look at the techniques. Brainstorming, probably the most common, but also the most time-intensive technique, where you sit around a table and say, what are the risks and what are the controls we have in place? And yeah, time-intensive and not always well-structured. Bow tie, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is, I think, a technique that explains, if you like, a lot of the principles of risk assessment. It's actually a combination of fault-free analysis and event-free analysis in one, and we'll see why in a moment. Hazard and operability studies. More if you're in the chemical industry and you're looking at processes and through the organization. One that every organization should be engaged in is business impact analysis. Understanding all your processes, and then what if that process was interrupted for an hour, for a day. And when I say interrupted, the interruption could come from a loss of electricity, a real risk. It could be from a severe weather event, a pandemic, whatever impacts the process you're doing, and you need to understand how does that impact your business and what plans do you have in place. It's a different approach. It's a technique. And then maybe developers of electronics might use failure mode and effects analysis. Again, a systematic approach of what if this happened, what would the effect be? That's to give you an idea and really to give you maybe a bit of encouragement to look at other techniques. I do a 3-hour session on techniques, but this is 15 minutes. Okay. What is the bow tie? You can see in the top of my slide here, it looks like a dicky bow. It's that's why it's called the bow tie. It's a graphical depiction from, on the left-hand side, the causes of something to the consequences. And the vertical bars are those controls that modify and hopefully reduce the likelihood and reduce or mitigate the consequences. Now, it's often used to display information about risk because of the graphic nature. It's useful. But also, if you build it up slowly, and I will do that shortly, you can start looking at the causes of a risk and indeed the consequences. It's checking that path. If you go from the cause to the consequence, what you're actually checking is, do we have the appropriate controls in place to prevent that? It's like layers of controls in one particular technique between the cause and the consequence. And it's a good visual to do that. And the left-hand side is a fault tree analysis, what can lead to the fault. And the right-hand side of the bow tie is event tree analysis. What are the consequences of this event? Those techniques are a level deeper, if you like, than the bow tie. And so the bow tie, when you don't need that detail, it's a high-level one. So let's have a look. A little bit bigger now. In the center, you have the event or the circumstances you're trying to avoid. And to the left of this, you have, starting with the causes, what could cause this? And what controls do we have in place to prevent this? And then you have detection controls. How do I detect? How do I know if we've got a data breach? And then on the right-hand side, you've got, well, if I do get a data breach, what are the consequences? And use this to inform yourself. I mean, I'll just populate this slide now. And the causes might be because the people are not trained, poorly skilled, or they got complacent. They've heard the story about cyber risk again and again, and that's somehow now passed. Guys, you need to refresh that training on cybersecurity, by the way, every 3 months. But people can get complacent. Or it could be that you underestimated the threat. You put things in place like policies, like procedures, and training people and checks to prevent it. But on the right-hand side, and the first thing you should have is, of course, a response plan. If it does happen, you want to limit the damage quickly. And if you haven't prepared a response plan as part of the risk mitigation on the data breach, then you're seriously behind the curve. I want to show you how you can use the technique to go from objectives to identifying an appropriate bunch of risks, for want of a better word. I'm going to take the example of a housing association. I know you're not all housing associations, but there are a number among you, but the principle is the same. So I'm saying here, if you move the knot in the bow tie over to the right, you've one risk, the failure of the organization. It's no longer viable, you close shop. But what if we consider and I've just taken these as typical objectives, take your objectives for your organization and move them one to the left. Like move the knot one to the left, one step, and turn those objectives into risks. I've now got, if you wish, 5 high-level risks that could cause me different consequences, one of which might be that the organization is no longer viable. And if I look at those risks, I'm now looking to the left and say, well, what can cause that? So let's take one of those. Let's take a breach in compliance and say, well, what could cause that? And now I've identified 6, if like, more lower level risks. It could be a data breach, which is a breach in compliance. It could be safeguarding breach, a financial reporting breach, safety standards, service level agreement that you've made with your, in this case, let's say your tenants, residents, and you've breached that, and you have maybe there's consequences, maybe there's financial consequences from that, or it could be your own policy breach. Remember, breaching compliance doesn't have to be, a regulatory breach. Includes it, I'm sure, but it can be other things. So you've now identified 6 more risks. Now move the knot 1 more to the left, and guess what? You're now at the point in this where I would say you have, from those 6 high-level risks, you've now got 40 more detailed risks. If you keep moving the knot to the left, if you say, well, what can cause a data breach? And you say, well, it could be cyber attackers coming from the outside. It could be accidental from an employee. It could be malicious from an employee. I've got 3 more risks to the left, or I could just leave it at that and consider those as just all of the sources for that risk. But if you keep moving the knot to the left, you're going to be at control level. You're going to have 500 things that could go wrong and leading to all of these consequences. So try and find the balance in the middle, a manageable number of risks, and you can look to the left to see where it can come from, and to the right, the consequences. Finally, I just say that the pros for this is that it's simple to understand, and it focuses on attention, on controls that should be in place. If you think about it, you see the consequences, what do we need to put in place? The downside is maybe it's simple pathways. You're not looking at the interdependent causes and pathways with other risks. But every technique can't deliver everything. But I still think it's one of the favoured methods of getting to understand a particular risk and what needs to be in place. So that's me done. That was short and sweet. If there are questions, happy to take questions. I'm going to have a look. I don't expect too many questions. It is a fairly, I hope I explained it in clear terms, but happy to take questions. We have 1 minute, and we'll leave it at that then. If you want to submit a questions, maybe under the Q&A, if you're not familiar. I think after 2.5 years of pandemic, most people now know the Q&A button in Zoom at the top. Okay, it doesn't look like we're getting any questions in today, and maybe that's a good thing. Thank you for tuning in. As I said, you'll find the 2 previous ones on our YouTube channel, and if you're around in 2 weeks' time, we're doing another one on the risk criteria, or the impact matrix. So hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thank you for your attention. Oh, there is one question. Hold on. There is. Should we plan for the future electricity outages? Yes. Personally, I have done it. I've put solar cells on the roof, and now only buying 6% of what I was buying 2 months ago. Thanks. Is the bow tie method recognized? Oh yeah, the bow tie method is one of the, let's say if you ask people to mention 6 techniques, it'll be in that first 6, definitely. Are the threats on the left arranged in a particular order? No, not necessarily. I think you arrange the threats and then you look, if it's a big threat, you might take that out as a separate risk on its own. But what you're looking at is, if there's a threat, have you got the control in place to address that threat? Is bow tie software available? I don't know. I'd say Google it, but it's a technique that you could start with a whiteboard and start with, say, okay, what's the event of the data breach? What can cause that? What we've done in our software is we've considered that, and we've created a set of questions, a questionnaire on these things, That was part of our technique. So if it's one of our library risks, we've done the questioning. Happy to talk to you about those. We've done it for GDPR and we've done it for IT risks. Not every sector, but we have about 3,000 risks in our system. But I'm sure there is software, but it's a technique you can do on a whiteboard, I think. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah, electricity charges certainly is a risk. And if you're talking about it from a company point of view, do consider or check that you have a UPS, because they're talking about rolling blackouts where you might lose electricity for 1 or 2 hours. And I will be asking the IT, how long will the uninterruptible power supply, that's UPS, how long will that carry the load? That means how long can the systems stay up with no electricity coming into the building? And whereas you mightn't have electricity on your desk, you might have in your laptop for a while, you want to make sure that if the battery is going to run out before the electricity is going to come back, then the system should shut down safely. Anyway, that's probably material for another day. Thank you for listening.